Despite what my previous video may have led you to believe, I don't hate Genshin. In fact, I'm insanely hyped for what they have in store. Which is why I wanted to bring up my problems with it. I don't want to see a game I enjoy now become bad before I can get to all the future content I'm hyped about. But being negative all the time is lame, and there's a ton of exciting potential for Genshin in the future. So yeah, we're talking about that. Specifically, combat. I've had lots of ideas about combat and cool things that they could do with it. Like having someone who punches for combat. They could be a catalyst character technically, but their punches have elements in them, and this is just Xiezhi. So yeah, that's an idea I had that did end up happening. And since it's an idea I came up with before it got put into Genshin, that means I'm legally qualified to be a professional game designer now. But to be fair, Xiezhi doesn't actually work exactly like how I imagined. My idea for punch-based combat actually started out with an idea for a new weapon type. So let's start with that. Gauntlets. Us getting gauntlets is probably the least likely now because we already have Xiezhi, but my idea for how gauntlets would work was a little different, at least. I didn't think that every punch would be an elemental attack. I was imagining it would all just be physical DPS, and then a charged attack would be a big wind-up punch with the element imbued in it. But again, this is kind of already sort of happening, so let's discuss something else. Daggers, or knives, I guess. Oh boy, a third blade-based weapon option. The idea for this one is to basically be like the opposite of what claymores are for swords, a smaller, faster version of a sword. Pretty self-explanatory. Maybe we can get a little crazy and say that its charge attack makes you aim like a bow and throw daggers as projectiles. That'd make it a weird hybrid of bow and sword, which would hopefully mean that it'd just be a bow, but fun to use. This could also include some kunai-type weapons for some of the Inazuma characters. I know Shinobu technically already has kunai in her normal attack combo, and Inazuma is already almost done, but this is all hypothetical anyway, so it's fine. We'll just say that hypothetically this happened before Inazuma came out. Staffs. This one's wacky. How I imagine it'd work is that your normal attacks are physical, you're just smacking the enemies with your staff, but the main damage would be in your skill and burst. Like you're an elemental damage based character like a catalyst user would be, but your normal attacks are still physical. Maybe as your normal attack combo goes on, it could throw in some elemental damage at the edges or something, but mainly you'd just be using your skill every second as a pseudo attack. For this to work, obviously, staff characters would either have to have insanely low cooldowns by default, or maybe staffs themselves introduce some sort of cooldown reduction mechanic, which would achieve essentially the same effect, but maybe then we could get cooldown reduction on other weapons, which would be cool. Scythes. I'll be fair, this one is mostly just because of Scaramouche. I think getting a second archetype just for scythes is a bit unreasonable, but I can barely imagine Scaramouche with anything else. Like, yeah, he's gonna be a catalyst character probably, but like, scythes though. If scythes were its own weapon category, I feel like they'd have the reach and size of claymores, but a whole lot faster. Maybe their charge attack could be a real quick spin in place that knocks back enemies, or it could pull enemies towards you. It's got a hook shape. That's justification enough to make scythes pull enemies towards you. But realistically, I think at best, we might get a polearm that looks like a scythe. It just seems unlikely that we'll get any more weapon types. Hoyoverse seems to be adding new combat styles by just stretching what the existing weapon types can do. What could we do with weapons without making brand new weapon types? As I said before, there could be a polearm that looks like a scythe, but that isn't quite as cool on its own. But what about a physical scaling catalyst? I brought up this idea in like 20 different forms already, but I mean like a catalyst weapon that deals physical damage. Ideally, I'd want the user to just hit people with the catalyst, but I don't think they'd change attack animations just for one specific weapon. Also, this was another idea for Scaramouche, but unfortunately, I don't think this one's gonna happen either. The idea of pulling enemies towards you, though, is one that I still like. You could have a polearm that sticks into enemies and then pulls them back, but most characters swing the polearm in a way that's not very stab-like. You could have a bow with a rope on the arrow to pull enemies back from charged charged attacks. You could just have a claymore charged attack that draws enemies in instead of knocking them away. I'm desperate to make this idea work. Please accept one of these. Charge attacks actually have a lot more variety with them than I'd expect. I mean, usually there's the archetype of charged attack for each body type weapon combo, but they've shown that 5 stars can break this if they choose. So most of these would be based on character rather than on weapon, but what about a claymore charged attack that just stabs into an enemy and then slices upwards, throwing them up in the air for enemies that can actually be tossed around? Or a polearm charged attack that just spins the polearm around you once like a claymore? Or a bow charged attack that draws enemies into you while you're still charging up the arrow? Yes, I'm still on the... Every catalyst charged attack is already completely different pretty much, but hydro catalyst charged attack that makes a small wave to toss around enemies. Or a cryo catalyst charged attack that just sticks ice out of the ground, knocking enemies away. Or a dendro charged attack that just sprouts up thorns in a circle. I guess that's kind of cheating because dendro doesn't exist, so I could say like anything and it would be new. But just the way you use weapons isn't the only type of variety that weapons have. There's also the stats. There's lots of new types of stats/effects that could apply to weapons or artifacts that have yet to be explored. Some of these have actually appeared already during events, like attack speed. This could either be a passive on a specific weapon set or artifact set, or they could be a potential main stat on some weapons. Just a way to speed up your normal attacks would be cool, though admittedly hard to balance. Just like cooldown reduction could be. Really cool, hard to balance. I mentioned that earlier and it's pretty self-explanatory, so what else could there be? Hoyoverse could introduce some sort of lifesteal effect, which would work like lifesteal. In a way, you could say that some healers already have that though, because they heal off of their attacks. It isn't quite the same, but what else can we steal from League of Legends? Actually, we could have an armor penetration style effect, which could either partially or completely ignore enemy shields, which would be great for specific enemies, but for those enemies, it'd be incredible. I think it'd end up being a passive, not a main stat of any kind, because it's pretty overpowered against shielded enemies. On the flip side, we could have a passive effect that makes any additional healing above your max be converted to shields. That might be a bit broken with like Xiezhi and Sangonomiya healing so much so quickly, and then having all of that be converted into a massive shield on your health. But to balance it out, you could like lose all the extra shielding when you switch characters. Speaking of healing though, it'd be nice to have something like bleeding to counter it, which would just be like a physical equivalent to burning, you know, additional damage dealt over time to counteract healing. Something that would definitely be fun to mess around with would be movement speed and or something to reduce stamina consumption. You can already reduce stamina consumption temporarily with food, but having that and movement speed as options for equipment could be a lot of fun. Plus, we don't really have any weapons or artifacts geared specifically towards the exploration side of Genshin, other than 3-star stuff like the Adventurer's artifact set. I'm saying it'd probably be an exploration thing, because I don't think it'd be that useful in Spiral Abyss, but Spiral Abyss spirals my enjoyment down into the abyss, so we can just ignore it. Now, while I've already mentioned a ton of ideas, to get to the real meat of Genshin's combat potential, we have to take a look at Dainsleif is interesting because he's confirmed to be playable eventually, but I don't think we're getting him until near the end of the game. And with all this build-up, it would be pretty disappointing if he's just like a Hydro sword user or something. But as I said before, pessimism is cringe. So what could they do to really make Dainsleif stand out from the crowd in his gameplay just as much as he does in the story? He'll probably just be a sword user. Polearm I could see maybe, but he could also use all weapons. You get to choose from your entire list of weapons to equip to him, which would make his optimal build incredibly complicated, but I think it'd be a lot of fun to have all these options. Of course, Dainsleif could also introduce a new weapon to be unique, but we already covered those options, and I couldn't see Dainsleif with any of those really. I think the real uniqueness for Dainsleif could be... What element could Dainsleif be? Well, any of them. But what if he was any of them? I mean, like, you get to choose any element for him to be somehow. Maybe his skill cycles through elements to imbue his weapon with. and like if you hold it down, it's like Shulk's Wheel of Combat Arts in Smash. This would probably be more fitting for endgame Traveler, admittedly, but still a possible idea regardless. Another option would be to give Dainsleif a brand new element. The idea of us getting a new element after these initial 7 seems kind of unlikely, but the one justification I could see for it is an element essentially for Celestia. I'll call it Urano, because every element name comes from a Greek word that became an English prefix. So Urano, meaning sky or heaven, that became the prefix Urano. They're different, even if they're pronounced the same. It's a pretty fitting name for a Celestia element, I think. Anyway, I'm not about to design a brand new element from scratch. So I imagine that it'd either have reactions with all other elements or none of them. If it has no reactions, then I think it'd be pretty neat to retroactively say that all normal hilly trolls are actually Urano element enemies, which obviously wouldn't change anything because there are no reactions, but I think it'd just be cool to know. And regardless of if it has reactions or not, I don't think Dainsleif would be the only character with this element. Maybe the only playable one, but there are other options. Paimon, the unknown god from the intro, whoever the original god is, if it isn't Paimon somehow. Like, I think it'd be a very small selection of characters, obviously, but that would make Dainsleif the only mortal with Urano, which would make him stand out quite a bit, I'd say. The last option for Dainsleif is simultaneously the most boring, most interesting, and most fitting, I think. He could just not have any element at all. He'd just be a sword user whose physical damage only. His skill and burst would be non-elemental attacks. Maybe his burst could just be a big attack boost to all party members. Since he was the captain of the military, he'd probably be pretty good at morale boosts. His skill could be a parry, like from that one combat event, Clash of Lone Blades, during the Iridori Festival. That event was probably one of my favorites, surprisingly, because it actually made combat really fun and interesting. I don't think that it would work quite as well in the main game, where attacks aren't clearly telegraphed and you fight far more than just one opponent at a time, but I think it'd still be a ton of fun to have a parry with Dainsleif that then knocks enemies off guard, leaving them vulnerable. Plus, Beto's parry is loads of fun already. I love abilities that give combat a completely different flavor than just attacking. So the variety of skills and bursts is amazing, and recently it's become more and more clear that a character's abilities can make a major difference. To me, how fun a character is to play can be the deciding factor on whether I pull for them or not. The most fun variety of abilities recently has been an increase in movement abilities. I literally only pulled for Yelan because her skill was so much fun to use, so I'd love to have a lot more skills in that vein. You could have a character who has just a quick sidestep, like a short little dash in any direction, low cooldown, dodge attacks, lots of fun. You can kinda already do that just by dashing with any character, but I mean more like Xiao's ability, just without the lock-on to enemies. You could also have a skill that kind of combines Xiao's, Yelan's, and Kaching's into one ability, which would be a quick teleport to nearby enemies, dealing damage to them, allowing you to quickly hop around a group of enemies. I think that'd just be a ton of fun. Just having more ways to interact with and strategize around larger groups of enemies, rather than just having to group them together and do a lot of damage, would be great for future abilities. Like an Anemo ability that just tosses enemies in a circle, kind of like when you tap a Venti's skill, but maybe bigger, and it tosses enemies around rather than just up. It'd basically just switch enemy position, so whoever was in the back is now in the front, and vice versa. Maybe not that useful per se, but certainly could be fun for strategizing against groups of enemies. You could also have a burst that could trap enemies in a small area, either to trap them in there with you or keep them away from you while you deal with other enemies. It'd probably break if enemies did enough damage to it, but it could also just have a time duration, obviously. One really unique way to interact with enemies that would potentially open up an entire new world of strategies would be an ability like Chongyun's skill, or Bennett's burst at C6, that changes the element of attacks, but for enemy attacks. So any enemy in that area would have all their attacks become one specific element. You could use this to prevent 2 slimes from removing years from your lifespan, or you could even go all in on building resistance to one specific element and then just making all enemies do that type of damage to you. I feel like realistically, an ability like this would either be incredibly broken or incredibly useless. It just seems difficult to balance effectively if I think about it, but if Hoyoverse ever figures out a way to do it, then I think it'd be a ton of fun to use. Really, the variety of DPS abilities out there is already pretty good, but support abilities still have a lot of untapped potential. Most supports are either like, here's a shield so you don't take damage, or here's some health to undo all that damage you took. And it's really the more unique ones that seem to be the best. Like, there's still some potential with just healing or shielding. You could have a thorn shield of some kind that hurts enemies who hit you, like Spiky Shield from Pokemon, or I guess the Thorns enchantment from Minecraft. But maybe the durability of this shield could scale with attack along with the Thorn's damage. Or you could have something crazy as a healing burst that just spikes all allies' attacks to really high damage for a brief moment, but instead of hitting enemies during this, all damage is stored as an amount to heal allies by slowly over the next like 15 seconds or something. So it's like a quick swap burst of health that gets spread out over time, so you're constantly being topped up on HP. But supports don't have to just be about healing and shielding. So what about a burst that lowers all allies' burst cooldowns by a specific amount and maybe gives them a bit of energy as well? That way you can just dump 5,000% energy recharge onto your support and then 0 onto everybody else and it'll be fine. There's also the obvious option of a 5-star Bennett, kind of like how Yelan is sort of just a 5-star Xiezhi, like not actually a straight upgrade, but fulfills a similar purpose, right? So just a 5-star that does only the attack boost of Bennett with no healing, a better attack boost at the cost of now having to have a separate party member to keep your team alive. So that was pretty fun, wasn't it? I didn't think I would spend so long talking about just combat ideas alone. I also don't have an overarching message with this video that I can summarize in a single climactic final sentence, so I don't really know how to transition into the end. Thank you guys so much for all the support you've been giving. Like 10k? You guys gotta stop hitting major milestones faster than I can make videos. I don't think my quirky thing should be that all my outros are a subscriber milestone, but hey, I'm incredibly thankful that they have been so far. Hopefully, I can continue to not disappoint. See ya, idiot.